Welcome to the School to Prison Pipeline Workshop. Our moderator this evening is Christine Gerchow, PhD. Christine's the director of the Academic Talent Development Program at UC Berkeley. She's also the director of Frontline Psychological Services and Wellness, who support the well-being and work of America's frontline public servants. Christine actually heard about our desire at St. Joan to offer awareness to our community about the aspect of our systems that lead to racial inequality from her Aunt Terry, who is also on our call today. And Christine offered to help us and put together today's panel, which is a result of her efforts and knowledge. And with that, I turn the floor over to you, Christine. Thank you so much.
Okay, good evening. As Rosemary said, my name is Christine Gerchow, and thank you all for being here. A special welcome to our county's district attorney, Dinah Becton, who I see is joining us this evening. I am a licensed psychologist, and I have over a decade of experience working with youth and families affected by the juvenile justice system. And as Rosemary said, I learned about St. Joan of Arc's effort to create dialogue around racial justice and faith from my Aunt Teresa Quinlan, and I am grateful to be part of this evening's conversation. By being here tonight, you are taking steps to learn about our justice system and perhaps to discover ways you can make a difference. In our county, we have so much work left to do. And at the same time, there's a lot that's been done. Just a couple of weeks ago, I learned that a new program called Briones Academy had been developed by Contra Costa County's probation, health services, and education departments to support our young people returning to our county's juvenile hall from the soon-to-be-closed Division of Juvenile Justice. Briones Academy is a sign of progress because it was the product of intensive collaboration between county departments and community stakeholders, all with the goal of reimagining juvenile justice, especially for the young people who have been referred for the highest levels of juvenile supervision and services. But this evening's conversation is about what happens long before a youth may enter Briones Academy. Tonight, we're talking about the human experience in utero, infancy, and early childhood, and how racial, social, economic, and political factors affect the level and distribution of individual health, what we sometimes refer to as the social determinants of health. And make no mistake, the social determinants of health are linked to the factors that lead to or protect from incarcerated futures. Take a moment to glance at this slide to familiarize or refamiliarize yourself with some of these determinants.
Christine, could you put your screen on full view? Right now we're seeing a small screen and a large screen. Maybe on slideshow. Thank you, much better.
Sure. One of the youth I used to work with, when he heard I was participating in this event, said to me, "Miss Christine, whatever you do, let him know that I didn't just come to this juvenile hall without a lot of struggle." And I'm talking way back when I was just a little kid. And tonight we are going way back with the understanding that we can't have a conversation about public safety without talking about public health and equity. So let's get started. Our first presenter is Professor Darlene Francis, an associate professor from UC Berkeley School of Public Health and one of my former and awesome instructors. I will let Professor Francis share more about her background and delve straight into some of our guiding questions about public health, epigenetics, biological adversity, and what gives her hope. Some of the guiding questions we had for Professor Francis are on this slide. For example, how does child and adolescent public health relate to public safety, and why should people care? She'll explain and describe how advances in science and research are changing the way we understand the interactions among genes, physical and social environments, and developmental timing, and how significant early adversity can lead to chronic health impairments and other risks, including incarceration. And she'll also touch on her research about stress and developmental programming, and most important, what gives her hope. As a reminder, if you have questions, please submit them into the chat box that is being moderated by the St. Joan of Arc team. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Francis.
Right, I think I've unmuted. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, let me share my screen. And then let me put this in. Okay, I think is that in full view for everybody? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm going to start a timer for myself because I'm a talker, and 20 minutes for somebody like me is a painfully short amount of time, and I want to respect the time of the other speakers, and I'm so excited to hear from them. And what I'm going to share with you is probably something vastly different than many of you have sort of been presented with before. I'm this quirky person who's a neurobiologist by training. I know an awful lot about the brain, and my research program, in my research program, I study stress and the developmental programming of the stress axis. And I found that it's often hard to jump from the animal models and the data that I generate and that I work with to how this matters in the real world. So I usually just take a little bit of time to share with folks how I wound up studying what I study and why I care about the things that I care about. So I'm going to use my time now. I have 19 minutes to share a little bit about myself and hopefully answer the guiding questions that were provided. So when I read this, I immediately want to retreat and say, oh, but I study rats and mice, and I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask this particular question, but of course I have thoughts. And I open a lot of a lot of talks that I give with this photo. That's a picture of me and my sister, and I usually ask the audience to identify me in this picture. And if you haven't already, I'm the little girl on the left, and my sister is about 1.5 years younger than me, and we have the same parents. My father is Black or African American. My mother is First Nations. And my sister, who, the person I'm closest to in the world, presents and looks to the world like a little Black, in this picture, a young Black girl, and I look like a big white girl standing next to her. And we've gone through the world together, right? Especially during these early ages. And I can promise you that the world has treated us so differently, and that shouldn't be a surprise, but to hear first person testimony of that. And my sister and I played sports, and we went to ballet lessons, and we did all the things. And everywhere we went, people would look to me and ask if my little sister was adopted. And I've never once been asked if I was adopted. And at some point, as a big sister, I'm witnessing the embodiment of those questions, and clearly that matters. And so much of my direct experience in the world has informed the types of research questions that I ask, and ultimately the type of research that I do. So I described that I come from a multiracial family, and I look pretty white to everywhere I go. My siblings identify as Black, but certainly a really rich family history and background. I also describe myself as an inner city poor kid. But I always have to qualify that by saying that I'm Canadian. And if you haven't heard my Canadian accent yet, it will come out. But I realize that it's important to qualify that I'm Canadian, because inner city, my inner city neighborhood is very different from what I've experienced here in the US. So I grew up in the island of Montreal, raised by a single mother, raising 5 kids. I'm the middle kid. My mother has only ever worked minimum wage jobs, and again, did everything for her children. But what I had access to growing up in my inner city poor Canadian city was universal health care, universal dental care, affordable higher education, and really safety in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And I think I mentioned already that I grew up in the poorest neighborhood in the island of Montreal. And, my life was so good that I didn't know how poor I was until I ultimately left that neighborhood. So thinking about child adolescent public health as it relates to public safety, and growing up as an inner city poor kid, recognizing that society does better and we all do better when basic fundamental needs of all of our people are met. And I moved to the US at age 30, and would describe, give talks and talk about my experiences. And I had just never been exposed to, the definition of inner city poor, American version in Canada. And I would engage with people and have discussions. I was living in the South, and I tell my story so freely about being growing up very poor, impoverished, but, getting access to great education and all of those things. And I would be having discussions with people, often young students, 22-year-olds, who would lecture me about my inability to manage my money. And my response is, what money? I don't have any money. I have to save, now I have a good job, I can save to do things. But what jumps out to me about living in this country is the extreme inequities with respect to access to resources, right? And that exists everywhere, but it's incredibly potent and powerful in the US. And this is a figure from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And what should jump out at you, and I can indicate here, is it's a really basic measure of health. And what you can see is that people who are living below the federal poverty level have the poorest health outcomes, and the people who are living, with the highest incomes have the best health outcomes. So that is not terribly surprising. And again, that a lot of this also is represented via race and ethnicity. But what jumps out at you, or what should jump out at you, is this gradient, that it absolutely matters where you fall with respect to your income, what your health and well-being is as an adult. Again, the sentiment that I'd never been exposed to in Canada when I moved to the US was this notion that poverty was a choice and that poor people are just really terrible with their money and they're making bad life decisions and all of those things. And so as somebody who studies stress, I went to look at the literature, and much like that gradient that I just showed you in that previous graph, looking at health outcomes for adults via their income level, we see the same gradient across a wide variety of health outcomes in young children. So these are kindergarten age children, and socioeconomic status is down here on the x-axis, and you can see, so the poorest children have the highest incidence of poor health outcomes. And it's across a wide variety of measures. So this isn't after a lifetime of hard living and poor judgment and decision making. We're seeing these differences in health outcomes stratified by SES in young kids. I'll talk a little bit later about the primary stress hormone cortisol. And you can also see that in children as young as age 6, certainly by age 8 and by age 10, we're seeing differences in this stress hormone level in young kids stratified by the income that they're subjected to or that they're living with. So the game is afoot with respect to stress measures and the stress axis early in life before anybody chooses anything, right? The game is just afoot. As Christine mentioned, she took one of my graduate classes, and the students take classes from this class from all over campus, and there are a lot of students from education. And again, so if we look at a education relevant measure, which is exposure to language, we see differences in exposure to language via SES as well, and how the early developmental window is powerfully important in what comes later for children. So somebody like me, I already shared that I use animal models to study stress and the stress axis and how the stress axis is programmed. How do I find my place or space in research? A lot of folks are interested in understanding health disparities. Is there a biology of misfortune? Why are diseases and disorders so unevenly distributed and similar to those graphs I just showed you? So what I have to offer is using these basic animal models to unpack how these early lived experiences become biologically embedded that then ultimately influence health and well-being when we're well beyond the early developmental period. We can talk about experiences that happen to you early in life that dictate aging profiles when we're in our 60s and 70s, as well as more proximate time periods. And I put a note to say that I'm hoping that some of my fellow panelists will discuss the adverse childhood experiences data. I'm guessing that they will, that is centered on children. So what I get to do in my research program is really layer context onto often sterile laboratory experiments. And I happen to be interested, again, because of who I am and where I come from, I'm really interested in social experiences and early developmental experiences. And I'm going to make the case that these early developmental periods are fundamentally regulating our stress axis or our stress response. And that's happening at the level of the body and the brain. Too much to talk about in a short talk, but if there are questions, I can answer them later. But the idea is that we can study in the laboratory how lived experiences are programming the stress response in an organism, in a mammal, that influences just about every outcome you can imagine that you might be interested in. And again, you could be interested in physical health outcomes, you could be interested in mental health outcomes, cognitive health, cognitive aging, academic achievement. For this audience, also incarceration profiles, fundamentally how our stress axis is wired, so to speak. So I'm collapsing across questions 2 and 3 of the guided questions. So to describe how advances in science research are changing our understanding of the interactions between the social and physical environments, developmental timing and programming, and what my research, how my research contributes to that. So fundamentally, what we get to ask in the laboratory, which is really hard to do in the human condition in the world where life is so complicated and challenging, simpler to do it in a controlled research environment, but we have to ask the right questions. So we're interested in understanding how information from the environment becomes biologically embedded. And again, I will leave it to you to define environment, right? What do you care about? So it can be exposure to toxins. It can be the experience of racism, directly or indirectly. So you get to operationalize the things that you're interested in studying. And we're at a point now where we can just declare that we know that biological, psychological, and social processes interact over a lifetime to influence health and vulnerability to disease. We don't have to remain siloed anymore to think about or talk about biology separate from psychology, separate from social factors or forces. So we can move beyond that and stop talking about if social or environmental factors matter. We know that they do, and focus on attempting to understand how these lived experiences are transduced into biological vulnerability. So how do we explore the how? So I mentioned I'm going to describe the developing stress axis and sort of get you to focus and think about how life stressors at multiple levels can program the developing child both in utero and postnatally to influence later vulnerability to a lot of conditions. I love talking about stress. I love the stress axis. Our goal in life shouldn't be to not ever mount a stress response, because that will quickly lead to death. Our stress response is incredibly adaptive and it serves its purpose, right? So typically when we're exposed to challenge or threat or stressors, your stress response, your stress axis responds to allow you to physically respond to that challenge or threat. So it's to mobilize glucose, it's to increase oxygen intake, your blood pressure and heart rate go up to prime you to respond to a stressor. That's under acute conditions. Most of us aren't out, in the savannah fighting baboons and lions, but physiologically, our stress response still is activated the same way when presented with stressors. So it's the fact that we're all here means that we've survived. So that's a great thing. But there's absolutely a cost associated with chronic, repeated exposures to stressors. Folks who study the stress axis typically often are referring to this particular axis, the hypothalamic pituitary axis. And I'm just going to mention briefly, I'm peeking at how much time I have left, so in that previous panel where you see the animals about to fight and both are mounting a stress response, that sensory information about the experience is being experienced by the body, processed at the level of the brain. And the stress axis is the site of transduction where that sensory information is then transduced into a hormonal signal that then causes the release of corticosterone or cortisol. So when people talk about stress hormones, the primary stress hormone in humans is cortisol. That stress hormone is released from the base of the brain and then travels throughout your body to allow us to physiologically respond to challenge or threat or stressors that we've experienced. So that's a necessary process. It's a good thing that you have a stress response. It's a good thing that you can mount a stress response. What's critical for all of us is the ability to downregulate further activation of that response. Mounting a stress response is costly, and that cost is metabolic, is physiological, and can become really detrimental if not sufficiently managed. So the work that I've done, that I love to do with the animal models, is to study how early life experiences are capable of regulating the developing stress axis in young mammals. And just a quick slide to let you see how some regions of the brain are exquisitely sensitive to the effects of stress prenatally and also postnatally. And again, if there are questions later about the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, or the hippocampus, but this is just a visual way of for you to see how sensitive our bodies and especially our brains are to stress early in life. So not enough time here to talk about a lot of the specific data, but I'm going to cut to the chase and sort of summarize that from animal models. we've been able to document and demonstrate direct relationship between the quality of parental care experienced early in life and then the later functioning of the HPA axis or stress axis. And pictures are better than any graphs I can show you. So this is just a rat mother that we use in the lab. And one particular component of rat parenting is this particular behavior, which is a rat mother that's responding to her pups. She's licking her pups, she's grooming her pups. And we were able to capture the quality of those maternal rat pup interactions across hundreds of litters of rats, measure all the stress sensitive behaviors and hormones that we were interested in, allow the young pups to grow up, and then look at the relationship between their early life experiences and then their later stress axis functioning. And then this is to show you that plasma corticosterone or cortisol in humans is directly related to the quality of early life care received by mothers. And I want to just mention that rats are a monoparental species. So that's why I'm only talking about mothers, but there are other models that are biparental and the same profile still holds. So long story short, that baby rat pups that were raised in a highly maternal, responsive environment, high licking and grooming, are able to sufficiently mount a hormonal response to stress or challenge, which is good, and that this effect attenuates over time much more quickly relative to rats who were reared in a low responsive, low maternal environment. My timer is at 20 minutes, so I'm going to just jump to sort of the take-home messages. So the maternal care contributes to the developing stress response of the baby pups. And this happens mechanistically via the epigenetic regulation of the receptor that binds that stress hormone. And again, a lot of this work was primed and started in animal models and is now conducted as much as possible in the human condition. So what gives me hope? I'm 21 minutes, so I'm going to steal 2 more minutes. I'm a ridiculously optimistic person. I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I still get excited by our animal data. I work with a very exotic Berkeley undergraduate student population as well. I haven't talked about any of the human data, but from the basic animal work that I've done, interventions at any point in time in the animal models, I can always affect change. And the most potent interventions are with the rats, at the very least, are when we wean them from their early maternal nests. We expose them to massive interventions. I can completely reverse the behavioral and hormonal programmed effects that I just described to you. When I look at the level of the brain, I haven't reversed the programming effect at the level of the brain. So language matters, right? So while I can impact later life of these rat pups that had these very potent early experiences, I hadn't reversed that programmed effect. And that means that the brain is able to actually compensate for those very powerful programming effects. And so that's really exciting. There's not time to talk about this. I just want to mention that in laboratory experiments, we often simplify things and talk about stress as good or bad and hormone levels as good or bad. And I want to make the case or leave you with the thought that oftentimes when we have these programmed effects that we label or valence as bad, right? That may not necessarily be the case, that those differences may actually be absolutely adaptive, and those differences are actually subserving living, right? So survival, rather. I have a dog in my lap who I'm petting at the same time. So it's just sort of a note for those of us who are engaged in this work to move away from this deficit model and really reframe and ask better questions. So I think I will stop there and happily listen to our next speakers.
Okay, thank you, Professor Francis. As I suspected, it was great to hear from you to really ground the discussion that we're having in some theory and some research. I know, I just share a quick anecdote before we get started with Natalie's recording, but at juvenile hall, it was not uncommon for the youth to say things like, we all come in here at 100. We're hot, our palms are sweaty, our pulses are racing because the circumstance of being arrested and coming into incarceration could be highly traumatizing and stressful. And so sometimes years ago, we would just thrust at them treatment programming where they would be expected to sit down and be a captive audience and listen to somewhat complex cognitive behavioral therapy protocols. And one of the things our team did is create these relaxation sensory zones and allow the youth to select the tools and resources that they wanted to calm themselves, whether it was an Evian, a bottle of Evian water to spray on their face, virtual reality, their hands in a sand tray. It can be really powerful. And from a therapeutic model, we shifted less skill-based and more attachment and relational centered. And so I suspect and hope over time there's more research to see if those types of supportive models lead to that downregulation of hyperarousal. So can we stop? I'm seeing your screen still. Did you stop the share already? There we go. Okay. So the next portion of our presentation is actually a recording, and the recording is provided by Natalie Burbick, who is traveling today, but was kind enough to create this recorded presentation for us. And Natalie is a social worker who specializes in health equity and social justice in maternal and child health here in Contra Costa County. And one of the things that she discusses is toxic stress and the many drivers from the earliest part of life and how they feed into the preschool to prison pipeline, because the same drivers of perinatal equity drive the preschool to prison pipeline. And so, as Natalie will ultimately share, the hope lies in bolstering the protective factors of our expected community members and the babies that they nurture. So I will mute myself, and I believe we'll get the video started. Hang with us, and then after we'll hear from Drs. McCurria and Sutherland, and then I'll have our FAQs or Qs.
Hello, my name is Natalie Burbick, and I'm the Perinatal Equity Initiative Coordinator for Contra Costa County Health Services Public Health Division. And today I'll be sharing about our initiative in our county. I'm not able to be with you live, but I will spend about 15 minutes just giving you a high-level overview of the very important work that our community members are doing to address birth justice and to work towards birth equity for Black families. Today, I'll be spending some time giving you some working definitions about the work that we're doing. I'll speak about how legislation became action in our community, and I'll give you some data, some maternal and infant health indicators that will further define the problem of perinatal inequities. And then I'll speak to the direct actions that our board have been doing for the last 2 years and the identified interventions that were selected by our community members, our public awareness campaign, and then I'll close out with some calls to action. So you might have some curiosity about what exactly is health equity? What is birth equity? Health equity is achieved when every person has the opportunity to attain his or her full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving their potential because of social position or other socially determined circumstances. It shouldn't matter where you're from, your background, your socioeconomic status. Everyone deserves to have optimal health outcomes, and that's what we are aspiring to achieve through our work. Additionally, perinatal or birth equity is the assurance of the conditions of optimal births for all pregnant people and infants, regardless of, again, their race or social inequities. So the reason why I'm able to do this work is because we had an activist legislator. Her name is former Senator Holly Mitchell, who advocated to have more investigation into why we're experiencing these adverse outcomes within community for Black families. Black infant mortality tends to be 2 to 4 times higher than rates for other ethnic groups throughout our state of California. And mothers are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience maternal complications or mortality. And it's absolutely unacceptable. This initiative was born out of the need to really dig deeper into why we are seeing these persistent inequalities in our community and in our state. So with the legislation came a plan that we had to do an environmental scan within each of the counties that had the highest rates for Black birth. We had to partner with hospital systems to really look at singleton births, meaning not multiples, twins or triplets, and really review and understand some possible causes and potential interventions. We had to convene a community advisory board to really drive some of the decision-making that came out of the work that we're doing. And then we had to elevate the awareness of this issue through a public awareness campaign. So again, we're really looking at what are some of the drivers of some of these disparities. That was part of our charge when we were given the task of doing environmental scan. And when I say drivers, I'm saying, what are the causes of the causes? You may have a cause of death or a cause of a poor health outcome that's medically indicated or diagnosed, but you want to look at what is really creating an environment that is causing these conditions to persist with a particular group. And we really are believing through our research and studies, whether it be quantitative or qualitative research, that these drivers are absolutely preventable. And they're rooted in structural racism. When you have chronic toxic stressors that are happening in the lives of a whole group of people, that plays out in things that you see that are happening in our health and in specifically our well-being. So you're going to see worse outcomes with groups of people who have historically been oppressed, who have historically been the recipient of chronic toxic stress in all the different domains of our experience here in America. And you can see those stressors coming from our environment, whether it be food deserts, exposure to pollutants, limited transportation or isolated communities, access to health care, insurance not being adequate, housing and employment discrimination, decreased access to quality and equitable education. All of these things are related to your overall topic that you have, and that's the dismantling of the school to prison pipeline. It's all related. There's a lot of intersections here. And really, the reason why we're talking about perinatal equity is because it's the same drivers that are pushing the school to prison pipeline that are present in our adverse health outcomes. And so you're going to see that if you address some of these social determinants of health, which are present in everyone's lives, and you improve on the social determinants of health. And social determinants of health, again, speak to life enhancing resources such as food supply, housing, your economic and social relationships, transportation, education, healthcare. When those things are in balance, you tend to have better health outcomes and wellness. And when you have those resources and baseline resources not available to you, you tend to have worsened health outcomes. So we want ideally for everyone to improve their protective factors for families so they're not experiencing chronic toxic stress and having these health outcomes, which play out in low birth weights, prematurity, maternal complications. Those are the outcomes we're trying to avoid by reducing the chronic toxic stressors. This is just another graphic really speaking to the upstream, midstream, downstream, and then the biological mechanisms that lead to some of the outcomes I just spoke to. And it's all preventable. And I say that with all seriousness. Racism is so complex. It is so much more than interpersonal racism that may happen, in community. It is absolutely embedded in our structures, and there are disadvantages that are absolutely preventable if people were treated with humanity, dignity, and respect, and their personhood was recognized in all the ways. So this is just a graphic illustrating that. So you may hear, like, what are some pregnancy-related causes of death? The top three for birthing people is hemorrhage, infection, and amniotic fluid embolism or stroke. A lot of cardiovascular drivers or causes of death, which have been identified by our Centers for Disease Control. And causes for infant mortality, the top leading causes are birth defects, preterm birth and low birth weight, maternal pregnancy complications, sudden infant death syndrome, and injuries. And so, again, these outcomes are more pronounced in the Black community. So again, in the Perinatal Equity Initiative, I'll call it PEI moving forward, we had to do an environmental scan in our first year of funding to really look at some of these drivers. And we came up with some information that really reflected what we knew was happening statewide here in our own county. So the yellow bar speaks to non-Hispanic whites. Non-Hispanic Blacks are represented in red, and all other races and ethnicities combined, that's the green bar. And so the red bar is what I'm focusing on here, is that you're seeing, again, the 2 to 3 times rates that are happening for low birth weight and prematurity within the Black community. This is where the disparity lies. And for infant death, again, unfortunately, we're seeing double the rates of whites for the Black community and nearly, again, double the rates for the overall Contra Costa community. And it's not something that can be predicted to change and in terms of someone's educational attainment. So you can be a Black woman or Black birthing person with a bachelor's degree or higher, which tends to signal that this person may be having many other protective factors. That does not preclude them from having adverse birth outcomes of prematurity, as you see here in this chart. There definitely is disparity happening with those who have achieved higher educational attainment. And that is in part what we believe to be the case for anybody who is living as a Black person in America who's experiencing chronic toxic stress. Your educational status isn't necessarily going to protect you from that stress. It doesn't necessarily again, precludes you from this poor outcome. And then in terms of severe maternal morbidity, we want to see lower rates. And again, we're seeing a disparity here between non-Hispanic whites, Blacks, and all races combined. So we really want to make sure that we're seeing equity in terms, we don't want to see any severe maternal morbidity, but we want to ensure that you don't have higher rates because you happen to be experiencing racism as a Black birthing person. We're also seeing disparity in rates of cesarean sections in our county. So in terms of Black birthing people, we're about 30%, whereas other groups may have almost a 10% differential. And the same with breastfeeding. We're seeing that there's, we want to see higher rates of breastfeeding, and there may be structural reasons as to why we're not seeing equitable rates of breastfeeding, after 3 months of delivering your baby. And we're exploring more and learning more about that. Prenatal depressive symptoms, we want lower rates. And obviously through this chart, you're seeing that Black birthing people are having higher rates of depressive symptoms. And when we're looking at poverty in our county, the data is showing that you need to make just to, to survive in Contra Costa County with the family of 3, an infant included in that makeup or composition, at least $125,000 a year. And the federal poverty limit is hovering around $30,000 a year. And when you look up the composition and makeup of Black families in our county, it's definitely more like the second graphic here, where there's a single income earner and the real cost of living in the county is around $116,000, and the federal poverty limit is around $25,000. And we're seeing that there are much more families who are in the federal poverty level and not able to meet the real cost, which speaks to a lot of the chronic toxic stress that families are experiencing in their experience. We're also seeing some perinatal inequities that are showing up in terms of housing. And housing is also a major driver. And there's a housing crisis occurring in the Bay Area that you should be aware of. And it's impacting disproportionately Black families. Same thing with homelessness or having to move during pregnancy. The orange bar here represents Black families, and you're seeing that there is inequity happening here. If you're not sure where you're going to live, if you're not sure if there's going to be stability where you're living, there's an undue amount of stress that is happening with that birthing person. So our work really did uncover that, there's a lack of continuity of care in some of our health systems, sporadic documentation of psychosocial issues or stressors for birthing people, Black birthing people, and that there was not enough support around grief and bereavement when some of these adverse outcomes were happening in our systems. And the third phase of our planning year, we had to establish a community advisory board, which was a really meaningful experience and continues to be. We have a very active board ranging between 50 and 65 members at any given quarterly meeting. And our community members were made up of healthcare providers, Black parents, nonprofit leaders, faith-based leaders, birth workers, meaning doulas and midwives. We had a a great intersection of members of community that would help inform about next steps. Now that we know the problem, we know the data, we know what's happening in terms of issues and for our families, this board convened and was very passionate about identifying supports for our community members. And here's a picture of them there. And we did a lot of, again, the research, and we heard stories. We did focus groups. We really wanted to dig deep, and we were able to in the time that we were given, and look at all of the intersections in our perinatal ecosystem that absolutely a pregnant or parenting person would have to interface with. And we had to look at what are the supports that are existing there and where are the gaps in care. We did a SWOT analysis looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of our perinatal ecosystem. And again, the focus groups really were probably the most powerful part of our process. And we were really able to hear directly from birthing people about their experience. Some I'll elevate is that my biggest fear is that I will be in labor and I will bleed out. We are not heard as Black women. I was alone for hours after the delivery. My child's father struggles with himself. He needs support figuring things out. No community. He does not talk things out. We heard these experiences and wanted to respond in really meaningful ways. So what we as a board determined is that we should have free community-based doula services for Black birthing people. And we also wanted to support fathers by having a fatherhood support program, Partners in Pregnancy and Coco doulas. So those services have started this year. We were delayed because of COVID, but we are absolutely active, and services are being administered, and we're excited to ensure that anybody who wants a free doula can get that support, and any father who's expecting, who is partnered with a Black birthing person can also receive support during the perinatal period. And what does support look like? So support can look like home visits, accompanying a birthing person to a prenatal exam, birth planning, labor and delivery support, postpartum home visits, breastfeeding assistance, infant care support, perinatal depression screening, linkage and referrals to health and social services. And we're hoping to reduce some of the poor outcomes that I spoke to earlier, and to increase family supports and community supports, and to really mitigate medical intervention if it is not absolutely necessary. And then our Partners in Pregnancy Fatherhood program, it's more of a support group and skill building opportunity for parents, for fathers. And it's also linkage to health and social services as needed. And we're hoping that by supporting the father, we are indirectly or directly supporting the mother, because when the family unit all has support, you're likely to improve health outcomes and wellness for the family as well as the community. And lastly, our charge was to create a public awareness campaign. And we really wanted to speak to the upstream reasons as to why we're seeing these outcomes, and not focus as much on the individual health behaviors of a birthing person, but really look again at what some of the drivers are that I spoke to at the top of this presentation. And we came up with the Deliver Birth Justice campaign. And I encourage all of you to go to the Deliver Birth Justice website and to watch a video, a 5-minute video of community members from throughout the Bay Area. We have the first woman in the video is a Contra Costin. And I encourage you to hear her story as well as the others, and to support what they're asking community members to do. You can always follow us on social media as well, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And lastly, I'd like to say there are definitely some actionable items that you can do as you're elevating awareness about this very important issue. You can become an ally for birth justice just by learning about it. Reading about birth options for community members, making sure people are aware about the data in our community, and, challenge the media's focus to really speak to the inequities that drive these poor health outcomes. You can have support groups in your community organizations for pregnant people, share information about doulas and midwives, the services that we're offering in our county. You can provide balanced information about hospital, home births, and birthing centers. You can offer non-judgmental listening and encouragement to pregnant people. You can challenge the strong Black woman myth. And you can create a space where vulnerability and asking for help is not a weakness. And lastly, you can educate members about the benefits and myths of breastfeeding. So thank you so much for this protected time today. I can be reached on my cell phone, 925-313-6123, or via email at nburbick@cchealth.org. And again, I thank you for this time and to learn about birth justice and the work that we're doing in Contra Costa County. Have a great evening.
All right. So I am so grateful for Natalie's presentation. There were so many gems in there, and I was writing a few down when I listened to it again, thinking about the causes of the causes, really sitting and being still when she was reading the reflections from the focus group. And when her and I were planning for this evening's chat, we're talking about how it turns out there's a lot more to the story of how people show up. And so that's sort of a higher level reflection that I would have about Natalie's wise words. And I'm also encouraged to hear about our county's free community-based doula services and the fatherhood support program. And I can share that my mom is one of the COCO doulas. And I am happy to, if any of you want to reach me through my email, which I'll drop in the chat, if you'd like to learn more about it, please let me know. It's a really special opportunity. And my understanding is it's gaining some momentum as things are opening up. So what I would like to do now is introduce our final speakers, Drs. McCurria and Sutherland, both physicians who work within our adult and juvenile detention facilities. Dr. McCurria is a deputy health officer for Contra Costa County School-Based Clinic and a provider and clinical lead, and a very sought-after provider and clinical lead at our county's juvenile hall. Dr. McCurria and I worked together for years, and I have tremendous respect for the work she did and does with our youth and their families. And Dr. Sutherland is the medical director of Contra Costa County Detention Health and an internal medicine physician for Contra Costa County Health Services. Her passion has been safe, high quality, and equitable patient care, especially for the population and communities with the most need and that have been the most overlooked and underserved. So without any further delay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I will be helping you guys with the slides. So just one moment. Okay. Are we good? Can you guys see it?
Christine, could you enlarge it again?
Yes. Okay, I'll turn it over to Drs. McCurria and Sutherland.
Can you hear me?
I think it.
Okay.
Are the slides in slideshow mode?
I don't think so.
I think you have to, at the bottom, there's a little screen there. You can click on that or go to slideshow.
Christine, what they're talking about is that what we see is the left part of the slide is blocked.
Is that better?
Not yet.
Okay, so if I click use slideshow, is that what we want?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here, I'm going to click use slideshow, and this is what comes up for me.
Let me see if maybe I can.
Christine, you're also at 62% slide size.
Okay.
I've got the slides going now.
Oh,
Okay.
perfect. All right.
Thank you, Rosemary. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, echoing. Let me turn off one thing. Okay. So thanks for having us, everyone. I'm Dr. Mercuria. I'm one of the pediatricians, Sophie, and we're excited to be here today to talk to you about kind of the detention setting and where we work. And I feel like the previous presentations really set up well in terms of, you know, the population we serve, a lot of talks of stress and ACEs, which I will review a little, and kind of the supports that is needed in terms of the juvenile population, and also, and Dr. Sutherland will touch on the adult population as well. Next slide. Thank you. Really in detention health, our motto and kind of what we go by is one care, and our mission is to care for and improve the health of all people in Contra Costa County, with the special attention to those who are most vulnerable to health problems. And that's really the patients we see in the detention setting, patients that many of the presenters spoke of, people who've had a lot of toxic stress, inequities that we're seeing in our communities, and people who may not have as many resources due to these inequities that have been mentioned. Next slide, please. So just a little overview of the justice system in our county, Contra Costa County. There's about 50 to 80 youth in custody, and that can change just kind of an average in terms of recent average. Next slide. When we look at national data, and this is from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Program, over the years, there has been a decreasing number of youth who have been detained and committed. And that's similar as what we're seeing in California, and similar to what we're seeing in Contra Costa County, is decreasing youth population. In terms of kind of charges at the national level, there's been a decrease likelihood of youth being in detention for drug cases, and then kind of an increase for property cases. And that's, again, similar to what we've been seeing in throughout California. And in our county, we've seen decreasing populations even prior to COVID. COVID really did decrease the population quite a bit during the pandemic, and kind of monitoring our population. When we look at next slide, sorry, thanks. When we look at kind of who's being detained, and this is again a national level, there is decreasing population, but we see a larger percentage of African American, Black individuals, American Indian, Hispanic, and so minorities are really being overrepresented in detention settings throughout the United States. And this is also, again, what we're seeing in California. When you look at the data from the California Department of Justice, they show that in 2018, for the individuals who were arrested for felonies, the youth, almost half of them were Black, 36% were Latino, and that's about a 2.5 higher rate of those who were arrested were Latino compared to those of white youth. And this is kind of similar population we see, in counties as well, just an overrepresented of minorities. When we look at the needs of, next slide. When we look at the needs of the youth in the juvenile justice system, studies have shown that there's many mental health needs, there's substance use support and needs, neurodevelopmental disabilities, so maybe difficulties with learning, and also sexual health needs, so STD testing, maybe sexual health, also education and kind of counseling. And studies have shown that a lot of the mental health needs range from mood disorders, self-harm, suicide, anxiety, a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of just stress and and also adverse kind of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that can lead to a lot of these other things. Many youth have a lot of other co-occurring health conditions, mostly mental health, but has been shown potential other health conditions like asthma or a higher rate of STDs within this population as well. There was a study that also showed higher rates of self-harm, suicidal behavior, and just in general substance use. And one study showed that adolescents who'd been in detention died at a rate that is 5 to 41 times higher than their age-matched peers and sex-matched peers from drug overdose, suicide, injury, or violence. And so we see youth involved in the justice system have higher substance use, higher potential for mental health disorders, higher suicide rates, and just in general higher injury. There's also been shown to be higher kind of neurodevelopmental disabilities in this population as well, brain difficulties, ADHD, communication impairments, and also traumatic brain injury may be contributing to these. One recent review or a recent study showed that maybe 32 to 55% of detained youth have had a traumatic brain injury that resulted in a loss of consciousness during their childhood, which when you look at the general adolescent population, that rate is only 5 to 24%. So a higher rate of injury. And then when you look at another study, kind of just reviewing lifetime prevalence of different health problems in who had been detained, and they showed that youth who had been detained in adolescence, they had higher rates of mental disorders, as we've seen in other studies, lifetime, self-harm, neurodevelopmental, young pregnancy, STDs, and then abnormal maybe cervical screening test for such as Pap screens. Next slide.
It looks like we lost Dr. McCurry. Can you hear us, Sophie? Let's see. Do you want to skip ahead and go back if Dr. McCurry can come back? Dr. Sutherland, is that okay with you for now?
Sure.
Can you hear me now?
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Yes, we can hear you again. Thank you. Are you there, Soph? Unmute. I think there we go.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know, my computer's doing something weird, but okay. So I was just mentioning kind of adverse childhood effects, and when we think about all the resources and needs and kind of the everything that individual might go through, potentially the inequities in our community and within the county and across the United States, we see that many people may have these adverse childhood effects or adverse experiences, ACEs, as was mentioned before. There's a wide range of different ACEs, and they can come from physical, emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, family members of someone in the house incarceration, homelessness, domestic violence, substance use, or substance use within families, emotional, sexual abuse. And these are just a couple of kind of individual level ACEs, but really there's many ACEs that's on the community level: poor housing, violence in the community, community disruption, discrimination, racism, and really adverse event or childhood event. It's something that causes instability in a developing child. And the studies have shown that the more ACEs that an individual experiences, the more kind of chronic health conditions that they experience as well. And that can include depression, cardiovascular disease, and heart conditions. Overweight and obesity can be linked to other cancers, kidney disorders. And so really things that over time can be linked to different health conditions, as we see kind of even in the juvenile justice population, with higher rates of mental health conditions, higher rates of mood disorders, suicide, and really how do these adverse childhood experiences lead to this? And the studies also have shown certain populations, such as minorities, individuals, or more vulnerable communities, have higher rates of ACEs than other populations. And so how does this kind of lead to the outcomes and kind of the vulnerabilities we see within this population in terms of that? Sorry. Next slide. Sorry. There's a lot of talk about toxic stress. One second. About toxic stress already. Kind of these ACEs lead to individuals being at kind of hyper arousable or a level that their body shouldn't always be on, because all the continued stress from these adverse childhood experiences. And so it may lead for difficulty forming relationships, healthy relationships, stable relationships, unstable work histories, struggling financially, health conditions like depression, asthma, as mentioned, obesity, high blood pressure, and even lead to kind of neurodevelopmental difficulties, or in terms of how language is developed, and kind of neurocognitive disabilities as well. Next slide. Thanks. So when we think about our juvenile hall and juvenile justice system, when youth come into the system, we screen every youth for their unmet needs or the needs that they may be experiencing, whether it's health, sexual health, mental health. And we really do address the needs while they're within juvenile hall and get support that they need, and ensure that we're linking to care, addressing these needs, doing follow-up. There's many youth have a lot of things going on outside of their health, and so they may not be addressing their mental health or their physical health needs. And so how can we do that while they're there? And we do a pretty good job of kind of addressing what is needed, what is identified, and continuing care that they may have gotten while they're outside of juvenile hall or kind of lost to follow up. Next slide. What's kind of the next steps in terms of what needs to take place for youth? So I think when youth are in juvenile hall, they get the care that they need, but there's a lot of transitional planning that needs to take place to ensure that they continue to get these supports, both supporting the youth, but it's really important to support the family, to support the community they come from, to think about what we can do and what is in there. What are the supports in place? Education is important. Vocational literacy, physical, mental, and how can we use existing things in place to link youth and structure to support this population? What stigma also exists, and how to understand and diminish these, and what we really do want to kind of break this cycle. So what is the stigma that may have been there because they came into juvenile hall, or what stigma may have existed before. I also think an important aspect is kind of what are these kind of stable adults in these youth's lives to kind of help them support any kind of things that coming up as they're kind of going back into the community, helping addressing any other adverse events that might be happening, support. What kind of family support is there in terms of, is there financial hardships causing these stresses? Is there other conditions? Is there something that can be set in place as a community or state or California to think about how to support families in place? Ensure that there's connections for caring adults, and really offer support as we can and go through. And thinking about laws and programs that are supporting this population, and reviewing and rethinking laws and programs to further support the needs of this population and how they can be fully supported, not just in health, but in their and all the inequities that may arise and the needs that may be needed to address. Next slide.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm going to continue this discussion, and I'm going to talk about our justice-involved adults. And in the adult facilities, we have an average of about 700 to 1,000 adults in custody in Contra Costa County. Next slide, please. So I thought I would just share a little bit, a couple of patient stories. First of all, there was a man that I encountered who had mental health issues, is in custody, and and upon reviewing his chart, he had described that when he was 6 years old, he was taken from his parents' house and put into the system, and his whole life was in and out of the system, and then ultimately, in and out of detention and mental health issues. And so really the impact of what happens as a child affects obviously adult experiences and all the things that we've been talking about today. But what really struck me was that as an adult, he still described it as, I was a 6-year-old child and I was 6 years old when they took me from my parents' house. Now, we don't know the parents' story. We don't know why he ended up in foster care and in the system. But for him, it's like he still sees it from the eyes of a 6-year-old. So that was just very powerful to me. And then there was another patient that we saw who, upon intake into detention, said, no, I don't have any medical illnesses, no problems, no dental issues, nothing. And so doing our usual evaluation, assessing, for clinical conditions, it was discovered pretty quickly this guy had hepatitis C, cirrhosis of the liver. In fact, he had liver cancer. But the thing about it, all of these conditions were addressed and treated. Even he was COVID vaccinated. So people come in the door into our detention health with many stories, many backgrounds, and we're here to support them. And I would like to share one of the, can you just click for me? This is one of our detention providers. And he said, I originally joined detention health to provide medical care for the 2016 ICE detainees. I stayed when I realized these patients are often those who were missing from primary care clinics, those who are homeless, mentally ill, actively using substances, and who could benefit from treatment and general primary care catch-up. Great teamwork with nursing and detention health providers. Next slide, please. So I thought this was just some interesting data from the California Department of Corrections as to, what are the reasons why people are in the adult facilities in the state of California. Half are convicted of assault, robbery, or weapons charge. You can go to the next slide. And we're talking about issues of equity. And so this is some data, again, from all of California. And in reality, our prison population is actually aging. So those over the age of 50 have increased from 4% to 23%. And those who are under the age of 25 have actually decreased. You can go to the next slide. But some things have not changed. And so when we look at the racial and ethnic breakdown, again, this is from the state of California. For our male population inside of prison, the story is still the same. African Americans are much, higher within the detention setting, 11 times more than white men. Then Latinx males, white males, and then other races. Next slide. And it is also the same distribution for the female population within the state of California in our prisons. So again, we definitely have issues of inequities in terms of those who are in our custody settings. Next slide. So like I said, for detention health, what we want to do is make sure when they come into our care that we want to keep the patient at the center of their care. And so some of the things that we've been focusing on and improving of late is certainly to prioritize mental health. Strength-based recovery model. We have a very robust suicide prevention program, and we have seen a decrease in self-harm and suicide attempts. We also want to improve and have improved the identification of their care needs at intake. Again, many, just like the man who said, I have no medical problems, he really hadn't been evaluated. He hadn't seen a doctor for years. And so we want to make sure when they come in, we evaluate for their care needs, treating substance use disorders, and we make sure that there's privacy and dignity in their interactions within the clinical setting. We have also increased staffing to provide that consistent care across the disciplines, and we address the acute care needs as well as chronic disease management. Next slide. So the big hot topic that continues for all of us is COVID, and we have had a very robust multidisciplinary COVID response within detention health. Today, there are 0 COVID positive patients currently incarcerated in the adult facilities. And we're really proud of the fact that we were one of the first county jails in California to start vaccinations. So we started vaccinating our population in January of 2021. We did not wait. They were at the front of the line, as they should be. We are definitely vaccinating our population. It's offered on intake. We also screen everyone with COVID testing on intake and a very robust process for trying to keep everyone safe and offering the vaccinations. And recently, some of our preliminary data that our vaccination rate within detention health did not reveal any inequities or disparities based on race and ethnicity. However, we do have an opportunity to improve our vaccination rates for our detention health patients between the ages of 18 and 25, and overall improving our vaccination rates. So I just want to talk a little bit, we've all know that we want to break the chain, from preschool to prison, and there is a cost for parental incarceration. Part of it is financial. There's increased financial strain on families who may already be struggling financially. There was a statistic that men who are incarcerated contributed nearly $1,300 less to their children per year. Also for the family, there's travel costs and lost wages if they're visiting loved ones who are incarcerated far from their communities. And so these are some of our costs. But then there are also the healthcare costs. There's increased drug use during adolescence for males and females when they have a parent who's incarcerated, poor school performance, and mental health problems. And so again, when we're talking about breaking the chain, how do we affect that for the adults in order to, again, give their children and families and their communities a better start? Next. And then some of the challenges are actually when you're released from prison. Some of the major challenges, including not knowing where to begin. We've talked about transition, reentry. How do we support those to prevent, the return back? Challenge number 2, the family strain. Again, that's your source of support, the family unit, the community, and yet there's a strain. And again, how do we support that? Number 3, finding employment, and challenge number 4, the mental health issues. So the next steps, again, as Dr. Mercuriat said, the transition planning, the reentry, which really, for us, we try to begin when they first arrive, but how as a county, community, state, national level do we support this more? Supporting the youth, the adults, the family, and the community, eliminating stigma, and again, supporting those laws and programs that are supportive of this vulnerable population. And of course, really looking at our community COVID vaccination and how we can have more sites, town halls. There's a lot of data now about the impact of, obviously not being vaccinated against COVID, but also how it's impacting our communities and our families. People are unable to work because they're not getting vaccinated. There's a lot of data now looking at our high schools in our local community here, and especially African-American high school students have a much lower rate of vaccination compared to the other races. So again, how do we support in our community? And the thing that we're dealing with, which is a major health issue still, the COVID pandemic. Next slide. So I wanted to just end with another quote from one of our detention doctors. And she says, "Our patients have often been unable to access medical care prior to meeting with us and may have multiple previously undiagnosed medical conditions when the medical team first meets with them. In detention health, we are on a mission to help our patients to heal their bodies and hopefully support them on their path to incorporate into the community as responsible, caring, and healthy individuals." And next slide. Oops. Maybe we lost that one. My favorite slide. Maybe we lost it. The last slide. Hope. That's it. I just wanted to end on hope. There's always hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sutherland and Dr. Mercuria. It's to be able to hear straight from the professionals who are on the ground is really meaningful, and I appreciate everything you had to share. I wanted to add, because I know it is 8:06, and I have 4 questions that I've seen that I can ask, but one of the slides you had, Dr. Mercuria, was about toxic stress, and I want to tie that into healing. So at juvenile hall, some of the times where I saw toxic stress, I'm going to give you some examples. It would be when you would be in court with a young person, and you're sitting next to this young person. And I remember this vividly. I put a piece of paper that he had for his first court appearance on his knee, and he didn't know I was going to put the piece of paper on his knee. He jumped about a foot in the air. So hyperarousal, responsiveness, so much trauma. He had been shot several times in his past. What else does toxic stress look like? In a classroom, it looks like when the teacher asks a young woman to speak in a more respectful tone, which can be, a very potent request for many different reasons. And she may respond with yelling or posturing. It also is the youth who has been neglected or abused and is in juvenile hall, and when given snacks, when the juvenile institution officer turns around, try to steal 2 extra bags of chips so they can put them in their room because they're not sure how much food they're going to have for too long. And so it's about survival. And I will share that those 3 are, stories. And I have so many from the many years I worked there. And all of those 3 youth have been out of the institution and remain out of the system and are working now and received phenomenal services from behavioral health, from medical, and from several nonprofits that are in our county. And so they are the picture of healing. And I'm hoping eventually some of them will be able to join these panels because they can tell their stories way better than I ever can. But I share that because what we've heard tonight, it may seem redundant, but it is real. This stuff starts early and it continues. And these are people's lives and families. And they're really important to all. They should be important to all of us. So I see one hand up, but before I get to that, I just want to say one person reminded me to define doulas. So for those who are unaware, doulas are people, they're labor companions who support childbirthing people, and they advocate for the people who are having children, their needs, and provide practical and emotional support. So the questions I have, one is for Dr. Francis. What recommendations would you make regarding public policy based on your research to date? One was for Natalie Bervick's work. I'm going to drop a link if you want to learn more for how you can do just that, learn more and actually get involved. And then maybe after Professor Francis answers, we have one for Dr. Sutherland and McCurria on how mental health issues are addressed for returning community members. And then we can get to remaining questions. So how about we begin with Professor Francis on public policy recommendations?
Let me unmute, and that's like the $1 million question. And when I want to retreat and say, that's why I work with rats and mice, because, but the animal model data, the experimental data, leads us right to what our other panelists were talking about with respect to how the experience of stress and stressors and trauma unfolds over the course of a lifetime. So if I'm thinking about policy, any effective intervention, earlier, sooner, as quick as you can get access to your population, like that's the silver bullet. Having said that, anytime you get access to your population, there are always things that we can do. I can talk about or just briefly discuss from the stress literature and what how we use the term stress from the historical discipline. It's not even a discipline, from folks who studied stress. The most powerful stressors are those that are unpredictable and uncontrollable. So as Christine was just describing, right? And so thinking about, I bump back and forth between doing this basic mechanistic work, which is important to make the case that yes, we're demonstrating that these early experiences are fundamentally programming the physiology of a person who is then going to go through life and be perpetually having to self-regulate or self-manage something that happened to them, right? Like truly. And it's really powerful as an individual being able to understand that. I've taught some classes at San Quentin, and I have to say the best question and answers I've ever had are from the men at San Quentin when we're talking, I'm giving basic biology. I'm supposed to be talking about basic biology, and then we wind up talking about addiction. And these men are understanding that, oh, like I didn't have it, like this played out. This is my life playing out. And I'm here because I'm a man of color. And somebody else is, in rehab, but I'm here. And there's an immense power in understanding how all of this plays out. That's at the level of the individual. It doesn't change policy. But if we're thinking about at what can we offer people or individuals in the moment, which is different from policy, but it's autonomy and predictability and control. And I talked about sort of the basic animal model work and, from rats, which is straightforward to study because there's one primary caregiver. But if we expand that notion of caregiving, that can look like a lot of different things. It doesn't just have to be mom. I would argue my silver bullet is my population of interest are pregnant women. And if we can support them in all the ways that we're talking about, that has the most potent impact on the developing child, right? So if we can scaffold and support women, then the bang for your buck is maximal. And then the further away we get from that, then it costs more to intervene. But it's fundamentally ensuring, I forget who mentioned it, Sophie on my screen, talking about just security and access to resources, the most fundamental of things that are often challenging in this society. I'm not brief with anything, but because there are so many ways to answer that question. So at multiple levels, we can think about what policies would be impactful, but earlier, sooner, and prevention is easier than trying to intervene at later points. So I probably didn't answer the question, but I will mute and stop talking.
You provided a lot of valuable perspective about it, and something that I'm thinking of for me when I think of advocating to policy makers, including the ones in our county that I email frequently. One of my favorite asks is please fund nurse-family partnership. To give you an idea, Google it if you haven't heard of it. Another thing that I would love to see in our county is the THREAD model for youth exiting juvenile hall and our transitional age youth. It's sort of, I look at it as a way more powerful and potent form of mentoring that is so needed because relationships play a key role in healing trauma. Okay, so and there was another question for Dr. Sutherland and McCurria about how mental health issues are addressed for returning community members. So either of you can take that one, or both of you.
Yes, well, actually, this is a really important topic within the detention setting. So a couple of things. I mean, we're very, very fortunate in our county that we have a integrated healthcare system. So we are, working in detention health, but we also work in some of our ambulatory clinics, in the hospital. And so fortunately, we, share an electronic medical record, resources, staffing. And so that can help to get follow-up after leaving because it's not a foreign system. It's not something, I don't know how to get you there. We can help connect patients. We have also a transition clinic, which is focusing on those who are reentering and specializing that care in the ambulatory setting. But the other thing is that we do prescribe medications, and we make sure that every patient leaving does have a supply, specifically for any psych meds. 1 month supply is given. So that way, in that transition, they still have their medications. So that's one of the things that we do, besides helping to connect, or they're already within our system, known to us, and those types of things. Sorry.
I just wanted to add one thing for the detention setting, and Christine can talk to this as well. The behavioral health unit for juvenile hall links families to kind of family therapy if it's an appropriate family. So they will go into the community with a community-based organization and kind of provide that family therapy for youth and their families as they're returning. And the mental health department within juvenile hall does a lot to ensure and aid and follow up with transitions, along with like a mental health navigator as well that kind of works with them for reentry.
Yes, exactly. And one of the biggest nonprofits in the county is called Community Options for Families and Youth, and that is actually headquartered in Pleasant Hill. And they provide something called functional family therapy. And for FFT, it's classified as an evidence-based program by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. I don't have time to go into all the details about it, but one thing I would say that I also advocate for is more participatory research, because some of these evidence-based programs, they do show results, but I think we could have even better programs if we have the families and the youth. They're deciding what questions to ask, what outcomes they want, and how we're going to measure those outcomes. We really don't do that enough, and I think we need to do it more. So that's another opinion that I have and that I'm sharing. Even though I'm facilitating, as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking we have some phenomenal nonprofits that are doing great work with all the programs that they're supposed to do. But I think we're missing a big piece by not having the participatory research. Okay, I think I saw one hand up, but I don't see it anymore. Does anybody have questions with us before we finish for the evening?
I've submitted about 4 more questions for you. Take a look at your chat, and then we'll close with a...
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. For Dr. Sutherland, the story of the gentleman who was taken away as a 6-year-old is tragic. Was trauma caused as a loss of childhood? I hope I'm reading that question correct. I guess maybe could you talk a little bit more about that particular situation?
Well, I think it just speaks to the impact of what happens to you as a child and how that sets you up. Again, it's just an example of an adult. Again, I don't know the details of, why he was taken from his parents' house, whether there was, tragedy, incarceration, substance use, I don't know what the issues are. But yes, that is traumatic. That's an adverse childhood event, right? A separation from the family that even as an adult, he still described, I was 6 years old when I was taken from my parents' house. And why would you take a 6-year-old? It's, most likely related to factors out of his control. That's all that I was saying. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sutherland. The next question, this is a big one. Isn't the challenge, this is for any of the panelists, isn't the challenge to not have the individual return to their same stressors and to have some means to guide them into safer and better environments? Does anybody have a thought on that?
I can speak to that. I think the more important thing is how to make the environment that they came from, because there's a lot of supports, and unless it's unsafe or there's other reasons behind that, but there's a lot of importance and supports for the youth, for their family connections as well, if they can be and where they came from and grew up. So how do we make those environments more safe and productive and kind of secure for the individual, and whether that's and how can we think about that? Because I think what makes places, I don't know, unsafe, it depends, and whether that's a lot of resources that we need to give families, and how do we ensure that those families have those resources. The functional family therapy can help to identify any other issues that can be reviewed and kind of mend the family relationships if they need to be mended. But how do we build those kind of safety nets and environments in places that people came from? Because we want to ensure that, I think prevention happens even before youth come into the juvenile justice system. So how do we think that in a preventative way for the future, but really support the people where they come from and places they come from in a way that's appropriate, of course.
I couldn't have said it any better. And I also feel like what you just said, Dr. McCurry, echoes so many case transition meetings where the young people would attend, and it was an emotional topic when it would be brought up, like, well, maybe you just need to get out of Richmond. And it was usually brought up by someone who was really well-meaning and thought, like, let's just move you. But this is their home. And so this is their family, this is their community. It means something to them. And so it wasn't always so easy to just pick up and go. And so that was something that I used to hear about at many transition meetings, and it speaks to what you just shared. Next question is about, it says as follows: there are passed down cases of stress passed from father to son, which have been going on in family lines for years. Same with discrimination. How do you intervene and break these patterns?
Yeah, these are all really great questions. I think if we could have the answer, we'd all be on the international news. Well, I think a lot of things of, some of the things that we've talked about, particularly for the work on the African-American perinatal equity and supporting the fathers, right? And providing that support, recognizing the importance of the role of, both parents. I think that's really important. And yes, we have seen this over and over. I actually, when I was a medical student, did some research in Martin Luther King County Hospital in South Central LA about intentional injury and the repetitive nature of those who, came in with gunshot wounds, stab wounds, who had a family member, a parent, uncle, first degree relative who had had the same thing. And I think that's what we're learning now. One is, how do we address that in the family while they're experiencing that? How do we support the children that may not be in the system, right? Their parent may be in the system. How do we support the family in our communities? How do we reach out to those who are, children or, family members of those who are in the system or in justice involved? That's really a big thing, and supporting them through their feelings, as well as, what we're saying about family therapy and reuniting the family and supporting that. But definitely, it's a vicious cycle that we're trying to break. We want to support the mother in delivering the baby, a healthy baby, healthy start, even start, all of those kind of things.
I can jump in and follow up on exactly that. Am I unmuted? Yeah, and say that these cycles can be disrupted in a single generation when you're modeling this in primates, non-human primates, or in rodents. So it's possible, right? So, and it's like the video we saw from Natalie Burbick, and she articulated beautifully that it's the structure of our society that's broken. And all of our, we're all actors in this, and we all have to navigate that at the level of the individual. But the onus should be at the level of the population or of society. And so it's that constant tension. And again, our practitioners here are in the trenches navigating this every day with every person that they're engaging with or treating. And that's focusing on the individual, which is what you have in front of you. But the ultimate answer to this question is disrupting the structure. And we've seen from every speaker today, the racial inequities and the economic inequities, and that's who's incarcerated, and that's who's carrying the burden of this structure, this societal structure that we have all inherited. Right? Like, none of us chose this. This is non-genomic inheritance of society. And we're all grappling with that. And again, it's very clear how disproportionately that is distributed. And so, yes, we're dealing with individuals and helping them in the moment, but the ultimate solution has to be meta. It has to be macro. Otherwise, it's putting Band-Aids and keeping people, as well as we can without ever stemming or fixing the problem. And so that's why there's never an answer to that. And again, to the folks who are engaged with this work day in and day out, who are balancing that perpetually, you're dealing with the person who is in front of you, recognizing that this is bigger than this individual, but yet this is what you have to navigate. I will mute. The rat woman will mute.
Christine, I think we're going to have to wrap it up at this point.
Yes, there was one last question. I think I can answer it, and if anybody else has a response, but it was, what happens if a juvenile detainee comes in and there's a report of abuse that's allegedly being perpetrated by the parent? And so, unfortunately, we do hear of those quite frequently, and the response would be, of course, as clinicians, you're a mandated reporter. You would make a report, and usually the goal is to have family reunification if possible. But if the allegation is serious enough, investigated and followed up upon, that youth could end up going into a foster home or a group home, they still try to have the reunification. Sometimes it isn't possible, but that's usually what we do. And CAPC, Child Abuse Prevention Council in our county, does fantastic work in that arena. So I think we got to all the questions. It's just about 8:30. I believe that there's going to be another panel like this coming up after the holidays, and the topic will distill down more into the juvenile justice system and what's happening in our K-12 schools. So things like restorative justice and disproportionate discipline. So there's still so much more to talk about and to learn. And I'll turn it back over to you, Rosemary.
Christine, thank you so much. You're a wonder. Thank you for pulling this panel together, for bringing such delightful professionals in. And thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you not only for being here today because you've helped us understand the issue, but you've also helped us understand what our county is doing to address it. And this has been very informative and encouraging to all of us. But thank you most of all for the work that you're doing. You're clearly making a difference, and we applaud you. We applaud you for taking the time to give your message. Thank you so much. And now let's close with a quick prayer. And Peg Wilcox, would you lead us in our closing prayer?
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Heavenly Father, help us to remember those who are in prison, locked up, separated, and marginalized, especially the children who are victims of a system that prevents children from living their fullest lives. Enable us to break the chains of injustice by helping marginalized groups, doing our part to bring equitable health care to all children, loving all of our brothers and sisters, sharing with others what we have learned, keeping children in school, and guiding youth to live their dreams and achieve fullness of life. You are flesh and blood. You deserve to be loved. We all deserve to be home again. God is with you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for joining us. If you have a question that remains, let me know, and we will try to weave answers into our next workshop. And if you would like to get a copy of the slides, or rather of the recording, if you would give me your email either in chat right now or send me an email.